Hi, my name is Ginger Savage. I'm 67 years old and I was born in Detroit, Michigan. I'm doing a discussion regarding the civil rights movement. I think I'm in a unique position because as a young girl, I was raised in Detroit in a multicultural area of Detroit with many, many different ethnic groups, and each neighborhood ran into the other. So you did not see a lot of tension or discrimination or racism. Part of my youth was also raised in Berlin, Maryland, which is on the eastern shore of Maryland, close to the Virginia border. This is while my parents were deployed. I was raised by parents who were very liberal, who had a lot of different friends from different ethnic backgrounds. When my parents got married, my mother's maid of honor was African American. So I wasn't raised with any kind of racism in our home. Where I did see it was on the eastern shore of Maryland because it was so close to Virginia. There were a lot of tensions still in that area. I think the civil rights movement changed everything. People who always felt less than were given a voice. I always felt very uneasy when I was with my family in Maryland because subtle things were said about the African American community, and there was even a hierarchy in the African American community. Maids, housekeepers, nannies were treated better than those that worked on the farms or worked in the chicken factories. So you could see there was a very big division between the races. The African American community lived on one side of town and the white people lived on the other side of town. I could never really understand it as a child, and I could never understand the discontent of the white people towards the African American community. So that was something that was very, very confusing to me. As I grew older, then I started living on the military bases when my parents were sent stateside. And on military bases, everyone was equal. A private is a private is a private, regardless of your race. So I didn't see a lot of that as I was coming to age. I was 11 when John Kennedy was assassinated, and it was a huge blow to our country because he was much beloved. And in the African American community, he was a supporter of the civil rights movement, having a voice. So I think it impacted pretty much everyone, some in a positive way and some in a very negative way. I think Martin Luther King and his decision to have peaceful protest was a great idea, because if you're too revolutionary, you're going to create a lot more division and fear. In 1963, we also had the riots in Birmingham, and I think that the African American community just coming into finding their voice just blew out of control, as did the white police officers. And I think people in the South who were brought up generation by generation as being anti-black, I think they felt this fear that their world was going to change, and I think they fought against that. I also think that people in the South felt they were less than because the people from the North looked down on people from the South. The South did lose the Civil War, and I just think a lot of people in the South generationally felt less than. And so how do you make yourself feel better? You choose somebody that is more or less than you are, which was the African American community. The riots in Birmingham, when we saw it on television, created a lot of fear, even up north. Not so much from, oh my gosh, the black people are going to come around and kill us, but there was just a not understanding of the violence and how you saw white police officers just beating people to the ground and letting attack dogs go after people. That's not something that we saw in this country. That was something that happened during the Holocaust. This was something that happened elsewhere to uncivilized people, and we were supposed to be civilized. So I think it created a lot of tension and fear all over the country. It scared me because I didn't understand the hatred. I wasn't raised this way, so it was something that I just did not understand. And it was very difficult for people to explain it because they weren't living in that situation. It's not something that they in the North were raised with. And I think this created fear in our communities in Detroit. You know, how are we going to handle this if something should happen? And then we had the Detroit riots of 1967, where we saw the same exact thing. I remember being 15 years old and flying back from Maryland to my home in Detroit and seeing the fire and the smoke raging over the city, and seeing tanks going down my street from the National Guard. And it was just a very, very fearful time for everyone. We had just not seen that type of violence. I think, too, that a lot of people felt, okay, this discontent and these riots and this violence is something that's happening in the cities. People in the suburbs were safe because they didn't have the diversity as much as the city did. In the suburbs, they were still very white, and so we weren't touched by that as much as the inner city. And I'm not sure how it impacted different races of people. I think it was very much black versus white, and not so much German versus Polish or Polish versus Italian or something like that. It was very definitely a division of black and white. And no other groups needed a voice at that time, like the Latino community, the Native American Indians. It wasn't really that important for them yet, but I think that the seed was planted in everyone about peaceful protest and giving yourself a voice to the things that were important and that mattered in your life. I think from there stemmed the women's movement. They saw that peaceful protest, they saw that giving a voice to women could exact change, and that was the big thing. Peaceful protest, or any kind of protest, gave you a voice, and that voice could exact the change that you needed for change in society, change in politics. And I think that a lot of people that were anti-women's movement and anti-civil rights goes back against fear, or back to the fear of change. You know, suddenly women are becoming more powerful and they're going to leave the home, and what about the kids, and who's going to cook my dinner, and competing for jobs and competing for education. It became a real competition. Who's going to win? Who's going to fail? Who's to blame for all of this? And I really think that the civil rights movement made such a huge impact on just giving people a voice that they didn't know that they had before. I think this also changed how politicians felt. Politicians want to win. They want to spread their views and change what they feel is right. So they go after the groups that can help them politically, whether it's the women's groups or the African American communities or whatever. There's power in numbers. And so I think that, more and more women started stepping up and voting for people that were willing to change, to get the Civil Rights Acts passed. The Equal Rights Amendment is still hanging out there, and I don't know that that will ever change. But it put a voice to equality, that we are all equal based on, your education, or whether you're book smart or street smart, whatever. It gives you a voice to exact change. And I think that's the most important factor in all of this. And I think that the politicians saw this, and if they had a liberal agenda, they went towards the black communities, and they went towards the female vote. And in that way, it changed a lot of opinions, and a lot of changes started to happen politically. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, I was 16, and it was devastating. I just thought, here is a man whose words were so thought-provoking and so compassionate and decent. And I think that it hurt the civil rights movement, because you saw more and more revolutionary factors coming in, like the Black Panthers, and it became more violent. And the more violent it became, the more resistant you found in the South and even in the cities. Just the violence was not necessary, but they felt it was, and you didn't have that peacemaker there anymore with Martin Luther King, with his death. And it being such a violent death, it was so ironic, because here was a man of such peace and a man of such devotion to his faith, and to be assassinated so violently really impacted a lot of different people. And I remember just sitting and crying, when is this going to end? Between both of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, it just was so devastating to the human spirit. What have we become? And I just knew that I had to give myself a voice. I had to stand up and let people know how I felt, whether it was my parents or whether it was the debate club at school. We needed to show how much we cared about change in our society, which led to the protests of the Vietnam War. That really, really impacted political change, and gave a voice to all Americans of all different groups. You didn't have the patriotism that you have today. You did not have respect for the military that we have today. And it really changed the course of our society. And sorry, I just had to take a break. It brought a lot of different communities together for one purpose, and that was to stop the war in Vietnam. And I think that's the first time that many, many different people of different colors, different generations came together to end that war. I think the unfortunate thing, whenever you have a movement, whether it's the civil rights movement, where you had people genuinely concerned about the civil rights of all Americans and wanted to exact a change. And on the opposite side, you had the KKK, who were continuing to do lynchings and murders and just being so divisive in the South. And the KKK, with the way that they dressed and the crosses burning, really put a fear in a lot of people, because if the KKK could do this, then so could somebody else. And then during the Vietnam War protests, you saw bombings and you saw violence coming out of the protests. So I think the KKK was a big force in violent protest. And I think the KKK was part generational too. They did not want the South to change. They wanted things to stay just the way that they were, where white and blacks were separated completely. And they wanted no power given to the African American community because it would bring them down. And I think everything comes down to power and who can feel most in control of a situation. And when you have generations believing that one part of your community is not equal to you, that's where you're going to have the fear come in and the protest against any kind of change. But I do think that the civil rights movement changed everything, from giving people a voice to creating different movements, whether it's women or Native Americans protesting for their rights, or anybody else. We see a lot of bullying today, which was the same thing that we had during the civil rights movement. There's a lot of this still underlying thought in people that if the only way that I can feel powerful, the only way that I can feel in control is to keep somebody else down. And I think that's very, very prevalent today. And I sincerely wish we had another Martin Luther King out there, be white or black, that could bring us back to civility. I hope this answers all your questions, Katie, and Katie's teacher. And thanks for the opportunity.